All right, finishing up Pax Britannica. I just finished the 1916 turn. I managed to avoid the Great War, although you can see that the European Tension Index is at 94. So at 100, the Great War breaks out. So it was a near run thing. And of course, I suspect that if you play this live, in an opposed game, you will more than likely end up in the Great War well before the 10 turns the game have actually been played through. I was, again, as I said in one of my earlier videos, more interested in kind of the sandbox aspect of this and playing things historically as opposed to completely ahistorically. The great powers made it through, they made it through 1912 anyway, without breaking into World War I. So I think this played pretty historically, and that, I was right at that Great War breaking out tension by the time 1916 rolled around. So, missed it by a couple of years, but give or take, one incident or a couple of incidents here or there, it would have been Great War on the historical track. So, it felt pretty accurate to me, even though I was playing a solo game. The end result, and you can see lots of blue and red in Africa, but also lots of gray and orange. The gray, the Germans over there in Eastern Africa, and the Italians in Eastern Africa, and a little bit in Western Africa. I even threw in there an actual possession in Africa, and most of the powers I ended up eventually, most of the game, it doesn't really pay to have possessions. In terms of income, you can, unless the territory is worth, actually, possessions don't really help you at all money-wise. Where they do help you is they prevent anyone else from putting their markers down in a zone. So if you really have a zone that you don't want anyone else touching, you might go for a protectorate or a possession rather than a protectorate. But generally, protectorates are always going to earn you more money, at least in the wealthier zones, than possessions ever will, just because of what you have to pay to maintain a possession versus a protectorate. And dominions and states are even worse, unless they're an 8 or a 9 value. And the only 9 value area in the game, I think, is Canada, which starts out as a dominion of Britain already. So there's not even a chance to find a 9 on there somewhere and turn it into a state. The winner ended up being Germany. They ended up with 268 points. That put them in first place. Britain was second with 238. Italy, surprisingly, third with 216. United States fourth with 214. France fifth with 210. Japan sixth with 203. And Russia last with 201. So a not unusual... I guess Britain tends to win most of the time. Honestly, I'm not really sure how Germany won. I am kind of sure because Germany has Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary has very little to spend money on. So, they have, I think they averaged out about, Austria-Hungary averaged out about $30 a turn. And that just gets added on to Germany's value. And so Germany, with that extra $30 a turn, was able to buy a lot of victory points every turn, because powers can use the money they have left over in their treasury at the end of the turn to just buy victory points. And so that's what Germany did, ended up winning them the game. The special bonus victory points, you can see here, like I talked about in my earlier videos, France had the east-west route, by arranging for a co-dominion with Britain and Sudan, and Britain getting a co-dominion with Egypt, with France and Egypt. So that gave France the east-west route and Britain the north-south route, which connects up through from Congo up through Sudan and up to Egypt. So they got the bonuses for that, but even with the bonuses, France didn't do very well. And I was thinking France would do a lot better because I had started to buy more victory points with them, but they have the worst divisor next to England. And so this, all this maneuvering and the costs and stuff of getting these, cheap protectorates in these cheap zones, I think just ended up hurting France. So I don't know that the east-west route in Africa is worth the 10 points that you get for it when you could spend the money that you're losing basically on these provinces just buying victory points, but maybe not valuable for France either since their divisor is 7. So, didn't really pay off for France. The 15 north-south route for Britain was pretty good. I mean, that kept them in second place. I think without that, no, I think without that, they still would have been ahead of Italy by 1 point. So, but it would have been much closer. So they definitely helped Britain more than it helped France. So Africa ended up kind of split between the 4 European powers, and there were still some, Portugal still hanging on to some spaces, Spain still hanging on to some spaces, but otherwise they were pushed out anywhere else that they existed. And, Britain ended up making the Dominion here in South Africa. And I did that partly because I kept getting unrest in these 2 zones. So made it easier for Britain just to keep troops right there to deal with the unrest. Over in Asia, the Great Game in the Middle East here, nobody ended up in Afghanistan. I think Russia had interest here at one point, but unrest in Afghanistan just pushed it out. Russia didn't really pursue it again. They did get a protectorate here in Turkmenistan or whatever it is, Turkmenia, Turco something or other. They pushed down into Qatar. Their big get was Anatolia, but they weren't able to make way probably as much as they would have liked in here. I think Russia certainly would have liked to have gotten Persia, but Britain jumped on that when the unrest happened and was able to outmaneuver Russia there. Russia, I think, was busy either dealing with unrest in the Chinese Empire area or maybe dealing with Anatolia at the time Persia popped up. Regardless, they just couldn't get the foothold that they really should have had. They did get a couple of empire areas. You can see there's a bunch of possessions over here in the Chinese Empire. This Chinese rebellion amazingly didn't happen, despite lots of influence being peppered around here. Didn't happen until the 1908 turn, I think. The first rebellion, there was another rebellion in 1912. It may have been on the last turn. No, I think it was 1912. Because after the first rebellion, I immediately established all these possessions in the empire area, which immediately jacked the tension right back up again for another rebellion. But the second rebellion was dealt with much more swiftly, generated fewer armies, and was dealt with much more swiftly than the first. With the first rebellion, obviously I underestimated how many armies I needed to keep here. So it took a long time, a number of war rounds, to finally resolve the first Chinese rebellion that happened. Russia very nearly, they lost this. I think they had a control area influence marker here, which they nearly lost their protectorate here. Britain was pressed in Burma, and lots of influence was kicked out of Manchuria, and the Germans were attacked in Port Arthur. Likewise, the French almost lost Indochina, and so these Chinese armies are no joke. When you only got your skeleton crew garrisons of 1 unit each, that you leave behind to minimize those troops abroad costs. So there was a lot of maneuvering of troops to get them into Asia and defend these lands. Obviously, Britain was equipped to do it quicker. They were able to borrow from their Indian garrison to push into Burma. Those Indian garrison troops can push out, I think, up to 2 areas away from these core zones, but you have to get them back there, or risk your garrison. Well, I don't think it's a penalty. I forget. I think they just literally can't move more than 2 zones or 2 areas away. So you're just restricted on what you can do with these 10 strength point units that Britain has in India. But everybody was able to gain after they finally eliminated the final units from the first rebellion. Everybody was able to work out getting 1 additional territory. So, and since it's free, I just threw possessions down on everything because, why not? So Russia picked up a territory here. Germany picked up central China. Japan picked up Manchuria. Britain picked up whatever this is, Yunnan, I think. And then France picked up Guangxi. So everybody got possessions in the Chinese Empire area, which almost immediately led to a second Chinese rebellion. This one only generated 1 army, though, which attacked maybe the British. No, actually, I think it appeared in Guangxi, attacked the French, and was killed immediately. So, and the powers didn't gather any more Chinese areas after the second rebellion. So maybe they should have. Maybe it would have helped France get more points. But, everybody would have gotten... Well, there would have been areas without control markers. I don't know. Like, some of them could have picked up... some of these areas are not worth much. Tibet and whatever that is. Not worth a whole lot. The pricier areas that were left, and I think 4 might have been the most valuable zones left. Yeah, these coastal zones and a couple of 2s, not worth a whole lot to the powers for control markers. The 4s would have generated a little income with a protectorate marker on there, $6 or so. So yeah, it might have been helpful. But at this point, I was just kind of ready to wrap up the game because it was on the last or second to last turn of the game. So that's what happened in Asia. Just kind of everybody got a piece of the pie. Japan really benefited from getting these Chinese vassal areas plus Manchuria, but in the long run, and you can see here too, Oceania kind of became a showdown between Japan and Germany, and Japan, they got possessions down there too, but none of it really helped them in the end. They still ended up finishing second to last, so, which I think sounds about right for the game. I don't think Japan or Russia have ever come close to winning a game with Pax Britannica. I'm not sure what Japan would have to do aside from just shoveling money into victory points at the end of every turn. Maybe that would have been more valuable. I spent a lot of money on their navy, and you can occasionally get the Japanese War Party random event that requires you to spend that extra $30 a turn. So it can, they may not have the money to do victory points every turn anyway. So yeah, I'm not sure. I felt like I played a good game with Japan. Same way I felt like I played a decent game with France, but they finished pretty low. Whereas I felt like, I didn't do a whole lot with Germany, but maybe, Germany having a possession in China, a protectorate in China, 2 protectorates in Oceania, 4 protectorates or 3 protectorates and a possession in East Africa. These aren't small gains for Germany, which was never a big colonial power. And they're getting some valuable zones like Tanganyika for $7. And did they have a 6 over here too? Yeah, Kenya, So, Britain, I think, just wasn't aggressive enough at challenging Germany in East Africa for those valuable territories. Likewise, over here, Japan, not challenging Germany enough in trying to keep them out of China and Oceania. Not particularly valuable zones in Oceania, but still protectorates that are generating that income every turn that Germany's just plowing into piles of victory points. So that's what happened there. For the British created dominion in South Africa. I don't remember if that was from agitation or just because they did it. It may have actually been from agitation as opposed to trying to keep troops there to deal with the revolts in South Africa. Australia was definitely done for agitation, for the victory point penalty avoidance purposes. New Zealand, of course, I don't know why you would ever make New Zealand a dominion. There's no agitation random event, as far as I'm aware of, that will penalize you for not doing it. So why you would ever do it, I don't know. It'll never make you any money. And, you don't need, Britain doesn't need troops that cost nothing to store in Oceania. It's just not a valuable enough region. So if they're going to do it, they would want to put troops in Australia, because that has Oceania access and Indian Ocean access. All you can reach from New Zealand is Oceania. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I don't know who would ever make a dominion out of New Zealand. Over in the Americas, Alaska became a state. That was a penalty avoidance. I guess it's possible, in the first turn, the United States didn't make Alaska a state. At the time, couldn't afford it. And although looking back, I thought I had to pay 60, and I think I only had to pay 20 because it was already a possession for the United States. So I may have messed that up on the first turn. So I dinged the U.S. for 5 points. If they hadn't gotten that 5-point penalty, they would have actually had 219 points, which would have made them third instead of Italy. So just a potential shift there based on my, I think, possibly having played this wrong. And if they get penalized once for not doing it, do they get penalized every time they don't do it, or if they eventually do it, does that cancel out the -5? I would think that they would get penalized every time, because the random event is for that 4-year period. If the U.S. doesn't do it in that 4-year period, that's a problem. Whereas, if they eventually do it, well, they didn't do it when it was needed. So I would say that you would get penalized every time you can't do it. So Alaska became a state. Hawaii did not. I never did pull the trigger on that. But I did, you'll see here, state flag of Cuba. It's actually the national flag of Cuba and the national flag of Puerto Rico. But presumably would have become the state flags had these been made states by the United States, which in fact I did do. I got the, whatever it was, the yellow journalism random event that gives the U.S. a casus belli against Spain. After I dealt with the Philippines, which you can see the United States over here did make a territory in or possession in the Philippines. I took advantage of the casus belli against Spain late in the game, once the U.S. had built up a substantial military presence and got their merchant fleets into the North Atlantic, declared war against Spain, and quickly moved in and defeated Spain's navy in Cuba, and then got their troops to surrender in Puerto Rico by blockading them, and defeated these 2 areas before Spain could even get their ships across the North Atlantic. So ended up making these states for the United States, just for the hell of it. I just kind of goofing around with this game and playing a sandbox version of it. I thought it would be kind of cool to do a little alt history here and say, the United States had many chances throughout the 19th century to potentially make Cuba a state. possibly more even than Puerto Rico, but not entirely positive on that. But it just never happened. The annexation of Cuba never really happened for the United States. So here I was like, well, hey, let's create a little old history. Also, the U.S. built the Panama Canal. Britain was really the only country that was potentially challenging that, and they never, as you can see, they never actually put a merchant fleet in the Caribbean Sea, so they didn't have access at the time that it actually became available, when Panama was in unrest and the U.S. could actually get a control marker in there. And as it turns out, I thought the U.S. had to have a control marker in order to build the Panama Canal. Later learned that that was not actually correct. I think you just needed to have you must have an established influence or a control marker. And I think when the game started, so for most of the game, I mean, this didn't happen until maybe 1904, I think, was when the U.S. finally built a canal here, because I thought I needed a control marker, and the only way you can get a control marker in either Panama or Central America is to have unrest there, because these are established countries. You can't just move in and set up a protectorate marker. You got to wait until there's unrest, and then you try and establish a protectorate marker. So I thought I had to do that. As it turned out, I could have done it with influence, could have done it way earlier in the game. And had I known that, I probably would have moved Britain into the Caribbean Sea with one of their merchant fleets, just to have that access, to get that canal access. So that was just another rule misreading on my part. So overall, an enjoyable experience. I think I had this set up for maybe a month or so, a little over a month. I don't even remember now. The time is all blended together during the lockdown. But still a lot of fun. Just slowly working my way through this. Kind of taking time with each power to think about what the interests historically of those powers would have been, where they would have wanted to focus their attention. Things like Russia being dead set on getting Anatolia. I mean, the great Russian dream of controlling Constantinople. That's something you can exercise here the moment that unrest happens in Anatolia, and then you weather the storm of a war with the Ottomans, and make it work. Same thing with the British pushing into Burma and Persia over here, and France and Indochina and Southeast Asia. You can see they got a string of possessions there, in addition to a protectorate there in whatever this was, New Guinea. It's hard to see. I'm trying to read it from far away. What is that? Sarawak? I don't know. Basically part of the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, I guess. And then, just some fun old history stuff, like making Puerto Rico and Cuba states. Just interesting. And, I even threw a possession marker down in Serbia for Austria-Hungary, just because, when are you ever going to see an Austria-Hungary possession marker in the game? Never. So, why not give it a try? So just fun messing around with this era of history and these different European interests. And again, coming very close to a great war. I never really hesitated with powers like France and Germany in building 10 strength fleets. If it comes to war, fleets are so important in this game. And so I think those powers would absolutely build fleets as much as possible. I even threw down some 10 fleets for Russia, in the event that they were called into a war due to their defensive treaty with France. Italy was building 10 fleets. And so a lot of just slapping down 10 fleets led to the increase of the European tension track. So, pushing things closer to war. And historically, that's why you ended up with World War I was, the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. The Kaiser thinking that, a great navy, making Germany a world power would bring us closer to Britain. We would be the two greatest powers on the sea, not realizing, that Britain's entire existence was based on the fact that they needed to have at least a 3-to-1 advantage in fleets and fleet strength to any other power in the world. So anytime another power ramped up their building, England had to do it just by virtue of their entire foreign policy philosophy. So uh, it's just interesting to see that replicated here, where as these other great powers that are not Britain, the United States, or Japan build up their fleets, Britain is just always has to respond in kind. So, and Britain, this is a game of control for Britain. Britain has to work to control the other powers and what they're doing. And I think I got blinded with Britain on South Africa and controlling and doing the north to South African path, that I didn't pay enough attention to Germany and making sure that Germany didn't get such a foothold on the continent. So, Britain just has to make sure that other powers don't get too crazy with protectorates and possessions and stuff that can start earning them money and footholds in the various regions of the world. So that's ultimately how it turned out. Britain didn't mind the tiller enough and let Germany steal a win from them. So overall, a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. It's the rules have some gaps. The fact that the placement of markers and stuff during the placement and movement phase is just a giant free-for-all. I have no idea how that would work in practice in live play. I think the idea of the free-for-all is that, hey, everybody just throws their shit down wherever they want, and then you hash it all out, from a diplomatic standpoint. That's what the negotiation's for. That's what the Congress of Europe is for, and ultimately what wars will help decide. So, it would definitely be interesting. Obviously, it would be a completely different experience playing it opposed as a negotiation game. I can see this playing much, much longer. Not as long as something like Empires in Arms, but certainly much longer than it took me to play it. I would think it would take many sessions with people doing lots of negotiating, even though there's not very many turns in the game. The negotiation, I think, would be very long, and you'd have to put down some rules to keep it from dragging, to an hour every turn of just people trying to negotiate their shit out. So, I wouldn't mind playing this opposed someday, but I really enjoyed it just as an experiment of messing around with what these powers might have been interested in exploring and developing and exploiting historically. So if you do get a chance to play Pax Britannica or pick up a copy, I recommend it. It's definitely an experience worth looking into.